My name is Ahmet Kuru, and the title of my book is Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment, a Global and Historical Comparison. In the world, there are 49 Muslim majority countries, and the average socioeconomic development criteria and the average democratization criteria of these countries show lower levels of development and democratization in comparison to not only Western countries, but also in comparison to the rest of the world. This question of Muslim underdevelopment and the level of authoritarianism is becoming even more interesting when we learn about the early historical achievements of Muslim societies in terms of philosophical achievements, socioeconomic achievements they had. So I decided to write the book to really engage with three alternative explanations in the literature. One is what I call essentialism, that single out Islam as the source of problems in the Muslim world. The second is post-colonial theory, blaming Western colonization. And the third one, institutionalism or neo-institutionalism, according to which institutions, if they are effective, they lead to development. If they are ineffective, they lead to underdevelopment. My book critically engaged with these three alternative explanations, emphasizing that Islam was perfectly compatible with development from the 8th to mid-11th century. Therefore, we cannot simply single out Islam as the source of problems. Second, my book also emphasizes that when Western colonization began, Muslims already had intellectual and economic stagnation. That's why the post-colonial explanation is insufficient. And third and last, my book emphasizes that institutions are created by human beings, and we have to explain which groups, which classes created effective institutions in early Islamic history and ineffective institutions in late Islamic history. So in the literature, there are articles and books asking similar questions, but the originality of my book, I argue, is the two characteristics of it. One, many alternative explanations only focus on contemporary problems without explaining what makes Muslims very successful in their early history. My book filled this gap by trying to explain not only contemporary problems, but also early achievements of Muslims. Second, many books engage in Muslim problems, focusing on Muslim world per se. But my book, at least to a certain extent, tried to compare Muslim countries with Western European countries. And this comparative analysis brings a more general argument. So what is the argument? The argument is that from the 8th to mid-11th century, the Muslim world had two dynamic creative classes. One was the class of independent scholars. The other was the class of independent merchants. We can call them an early prototype of bourgeoisie. So these two classes were really dependent and supporting each other. According to a modern research and funding, in the Muslim world from the 8th to mid-11th century, only 9% of Islamic scholars were state officials paid by the state, but over 90% of them were privately funded. And most of them were funded by commerce. Either themselves were merchants like Abu Hanifa, or their families were merchant families. So that was the secret ingredients for the early achievements of Muslims, having independent scholars, independent merchant class, creating a philosophical and intellectually vibrant environment and creating economically very dynamic environment. And by scholars, I don't simply refer to philosophers like Ibn Sina, Farabi, Ibn Rushd, But I also refer to established Islamic scholars, the ulama, including the early founder of the Hanafi Mazhab, Abu Hanifa, who was a silk merchant and who rejected to be a state servant. And most of these funding early Islamic scholars pay the price for standing up against authoritarian state leaders. Some of them were imprisoned, some of them tortured, but the way they stand up against the government and put a distance between themselves and political authority really create an environment of certain level of separation between religious authorities and state authorities in the Muslim world. So then our contemporary understanding of Islam rejecting religion-state separation is not really an inherent part of Islamic text or an eternal part of Islamic history. No, it was something created and constructed after mid-11th century. Until the mid-11th century, Muslim world experienced certain level of religion-state separation, diversity, dynamism. Meanwhile, at that time, Western Christianity, Western Europe, was under the domination of two classes, two different classes. It was the military aristocracy and the Catholic clergy. And these classes were neither philosophically creative nor economically creative. That's the backwardness of Western Europe at that time. But something happened in the 11th and 12th centuries, which substantially changed both regions of the world. In the Muslim world, there was an economic stagnation for various climate changes and various other geographical reasons. Then the state authorities started to pay the salaries of the officials by distributing them lands, by confiscating private lands, making state properties. That's the ICTA system of land revenue assignment to military and civilian officials. That was a problem which weakened the merchant class. In addition to that, a combination of Abbasi caliphs, Arab Hanbali, literal understanding of Islam Hanbalism, embraced by Arab Abbasi caliphs in Baghdad in the mid-11th century, plus Persian bureaucrats like Nizam al-Mulk, plus Turkish nomadic warriors and tribes coming from Central Asia. The combination of these three, Abbasi caliphs, Persian bureaucrats, Turkish nomadic forces, military forces, they combine their forces together to establish a Sunni orthodoxy that I call Ulema-State alliance. That was a major rupture with the ICTA system turning lands into public state property, with the alliance between the Turkish military Sunni forces, Persian bureaucrats, and Abbasi caliphs, an anti-Shia, anti-Mu'tazila, anti-philosopher Sunni orthodoxy emerge. And this Sunni orthodoxy under the Seljuk Empire, starting with the mid-11th century, established itself through institutions, especially madrasas. And the main founder of the madrasa network was a Persian bureaucrat, Nizam al-Mulk, the prime minister of the Seljuk Empire. That's why this network was called Nizamiya madrasas. And these Nizamiya madrasas exclude philosophy, exclude rationalist theology of Mu'tazilas, and exclude Shia diverse opinions, and produce an ulama class, a Sunni ulama class, who were ready to be state servants because of the decline of merchant class. Now state funding became more appealing, and the ulama accept to ally with the state. And this alliance became very similar to the previous alliance between Catholic Church and military authorities in Western Europe. And the Ulema-State alliance in Central Asia, Iran, and Iraq started to marginalize and exclude the writings of philosophers from the syllabus, marginalize the merchants, create a military state structure controlling even the economy. Meanwhile, in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, Muslim world experienced foreign invasions. Mongols from the east, Crusaders from the west. And the result was that many people and the masses realized the priority of survival. For them, survival against the foreign occupiers, these barbarians, military heroes were pivotal. And a major military hero emerged in the western part of Middle East, in today's Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. His name was Saladin. And Saladin defeated Crusaders, recaptured Jerusalem, became a military hero. And he was the one who established Ayyubi dynasty, which later on gave birth to Mamluk Sultanate. And with Saladin, Ayyubis, and Mamluks, Sunni Ulema-State alliance spread from the earlier Seljuk model to Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, establishing Nizamiya-type madrasas. And the Mongol and Crusader invasions helped the Ulema-State alliance in a way that people sought refuge from the military heroes and religious explanations rather than philosophy, arts, and other flourishing of Muslim early civilization. Now survival became the priority with military and religious authorities. After the invasions, Muslims recovered militarily and politically, and they established three powerful empires, Ottoman, Safavi, and Mughal empires. But they never recovered philosophically or even economically. These three empires are very effective to use military technologies, including gunpowder. But since they embraced the early Seljuk model, Ulema-State alliance, later developed by Mamluks, and different versions of this model became paramount, especially in the Ottomans and Safavis. We see the ongoing marginalization of philosophy and commercial activities and classes. In Europe, meanwhile, we see that a bourgeois class emerged, became very powerful in city-states such as Venice and Genoa. Italy became source of Renaissance, then the Reformation, printing revolution, geographical discoveries, scientific revolution. All of these transformations in Western Europe were mostly led by the bourgeois class controlling parliaments in city-states, later on in Britain and Netherlands. In addition to the universities opening all around Western Europe, creating a class of intellectuals, class of scholars, religious scholars, philosophical class scholars, then scientists. And this dynamic bourgeoisie and intellectual class led the rise of Western Europe. But that was not the case in the Muslim world. Out of the three instruments Western Europeans use very effectively, gunpowder, nautical compass, and printing press, the Muslim empires of the Ottomans, Safavi, and Mughals from the 16th to 18th century only use effectively gunpowder. Because in the negotiation table of the power holders in these empires, there were military commanders who realized the importance of gunpowder, but they did not understand the importance of printing press or nautical compass because they were army commanders. And the ulama class were the only educated class to make decisions in the negotiation table of the Ottoman courts, Safavi Mughal courts, but they regarded the printing press as a potential threat, as a risky technology. Therefore, for about 3 centuries, there was no printing press in the Muslim world. The gap between the Gutenberg Bible printing in Germany and the first book, Ibrahim Müteferrika, printed in the Ottoman Empire, there was about 280 years gap. The result was very detrimental for the Muslim world. By early 1800s, the average literacy rate in Western Europe reached to around 31%, whereas in the Ottoman Empire, the estimate average at that time by early 1800 was only 1%. And this gap of literacy continues in the Muslim world by and large until present. So Muslim politicians and scholars realized this problem. There were attempts to modernize, attempts to open new schools, restrict the authority of ulama. From Atatürk of Turkey to Cemal Abdel Nasser to Egypt, there were secularist leaders in the late 19th and throughout 20th century. But they couldn't solve the problems either, because these were mostly military generals who did not appreciate the critical thinking of intellectuals or economic creativity of the bourgeoisie. And with the absence of bourgeois class, intellectual class, Muslim world reproduced rentierism, especially with the oil money. Rentierism became stronger. Different forms of Ulema-State alliance, and the result is intellectual and economic stagnation. So, to conclude, my book emphasizes that there are serious socioeconomic and political problems in the Muslim world today. It is not a result of Islam, because Muslims had 4 or 5 centuries of a brilliant civilization with Islam in their early history. It's not about Western colonization, because when colonization began, Muslims already had problems. It is not institutions per se, because institutions were created by human beings, and we have to pinpoint who the humans, actors, who the classes are. And when you look at the classes, the policy recommendation of the book is that Muslims really need an intellectual class to recreate their intellectual creativity and dynamism, and they need a bourgeois class to have economic competition, innovation, and a world-class contribution. Thanks for listening.